Okay, again, I'd like to welcome you all to day 2 of our interactive workshop series about incorporating geography into National Survey of Early Care and Education, or NSECE Analyses. Today's workshop will be covering defining communities in the NSECE. My name is Vrinda Mahishi, and I am a data project manager for the Child and Family Data Archive, also known as CF Data. And I am joined today by my colleagues from NORC. But before I turn the workshop over to them, I will briefly highlight a few NSECE resources available to you on the CF Data website, which is where you will go to access the public use data and level 1 restricted use data for the NSECE. So our website is available at childandfamilydataarchive.org. Through the website, you can explore data, learn more about childcare and early education research, and discover the training opportunities presented by CF Data. We encourage new users to the NSECE to visit the data training resources from the NSECE page, which can be found under the Support for Researchers tab, which has actually newly been renamed the Resources tab on our website. The first tab here on the DTR page gives an overview of the study, including a video on getting to know the 2019 NSECE. Then we have the second tab called The Data, which is an easy way to download the quick tabulation manuals and users guides to help you get familiar with the data sets available. And then once you have decided what files you will need for your analysis, you can click on the links there under that tab to go to the 2019 or 2012 study homepages, where you can learn more about how to either download the publicly available data or apply for access to the level 1 restricted use data. We also have a collection of video resources on our website, which you can find under the Resources tab. And here you will find many videos of data release webinars and their accompanying slides here, as well as data trainings offered by data producers, including several past trainings about the NSECE. So you can just use the filter here to view videos by a particular data set. And a recording of parts of yesterday's workshop and today's workshop will be added to this page when available. To find out more, please visit the CF Data website, where you can also sign up for our listserv to receive notifications on new data release announcements, data webinars, and also our quarterly newsletter. And also, please contact us at cfdata-help@umich.edu if you have any questions about accessing the data. And now I am happy to turn the workshop over to the NSECE team.
Wonderful. Well, hello and good afternoon. My name is Alana Ventura, and I'm a methodologist at NORC on the NSECE, and I'll be walking us through understanding geography on the NSECE for us today. So we'll start with understanding provider clusters, and then talk a little bit about weights and inferences, research questions and strategies, and then some level 2 processes. We're going to spend a good bit of time in breakout groups today working through and getting used to some of the data so that you can all more comfortably, we hope, use the NSECE in your own work. So everyone should already have access to the data set we'll be working through and the activities in the workshop. So I'm not going to say too much more about that now, but we also have some references and written materials that you may also find useful to review after the workshop. So let's jump in. So the NSECE embeds a few important geographic units into its sample design. These are states, primary sampling units, or PSUs as we call them, and provider clusters. PSUs are generally counties, or if in sparsely populated areas, clusters of contiguous counties. A geographic unit in the NSECE that's unique to the NSECE, rather, is the provider cluster, which provides a powerful method by which to measure the supply of VCEs for households in that area. In other words, the provider cluster links households and their nearby providers, which can be useful for analysis or analysis of supply and demand of early child care and education, or ECEs. We'll talk a little bit more about provider clusters in the next few slides. So importantly, going back to three geographic units embedded into the NSECE, which are states, PSUs, and provider clusters. So researchers can use any of these three units of analyses for their work comfortably. For example, the sample selects units from all 50 states plus the District of Columbia, and therefore it's possible to derive weighted level state estimates. However, the NSECE does not embed school districts, municipalities, or zip codes, for example, into the sample design. So researchers cannot use the NSECE to produce valid estimates on, for example, all the school districts in the US, because school districts are not part of the NSECE frame. So now let's talk a little bit more about this unique to the NSECE geography, the provider cluster. So there are about 750 provider clusters in each year of NSECE data. We start sampling from anchor census tracts, which is the yellow region with the star at its centroid here on the screen, for the household survey. So there are on average about 4,000 people per US Census tract, which is roughly on average about 1,500 households. However, of course, this does vary. There are tracts with much fewer people, and others that go up to about 8,000 people on the upper bound. So because tracts are based on the number of people, they can be very small geographically in urban population-dense regions and quite large in more rural areas. Tracts, unlike, for example, voting districts, are not really gerrymandered, so they do tend to align with geographic boundaries, like, for example, waterways or highways. And just to make sure that we're all on the same page here with this example on the screen, the tracts are these kind of thicker black lines. So next, to get to the provider cluster, we start from the yellow sample tract and draw out a 2-mile radius from its centroid, or the middle of the tract. The provider cluster is in the gray area, and it represents the census tract through which the blue circle passes. We then sample providers from throughout the gray and yellow portions for the center-based and listed home-based provider surveys. And just for some idea of what it looks like on the survey, our smallest provider cluster is about 11 square miles, and the median is 57 square miles. Now, understanding these key characteristics of clusters like size and coverage is a key goal of the first activity that we're going to discuss in the next section. But first, just a little bit more about these provider clusters. So importantly, the NSECE provider clusters are defined in the same way everywhere, but they can look different from one another. So what does that mean? Clusters can vary widely in size because of population density. The number of census tracts in a cluster is a rough proxy for how many people live in that cluster. And the number of providers interviewed will be somewhat related to the number of providers also in that cluster. But the same thing cannot be said about households in the cluster. Additionally, households may use providers outside of their clusters. However, we can't really control for that too much in the survey sample. And this is also relevant basically because of state boundaries, because NSECE provider clusters are defined to end at state boundaries to reflect state-specific licensing, subsidy, public pre-K, and other policy rules. So, of course, what does this mean? If someone lives on the border, say, on the Illinois side of St. Louis, they may very well send their child to a provider in the Missouri side of St. Louis or vice versa, but the provider cluster they're a part of in the data will be within the state in which they live. Just a few more things. So household sampling is only from the anchor tract. I want to make sure to specify that again. So it's not affected by the characteristics of the rest of the cluster. And while there are always households to sample, there are not always providers to sample because of variability in local supply. So a low number of providers in the data file is generally an indication of a low number of providers in that area. And so just before we do that, we're going to just talk a little bit about the idea of cluster aggregates to get a better sense of weighting and how this works, which is going to be relevant for understanding the second activity that we are going to do today.
Can we stop for a moment? There's a question about some clarification about households in the central tract.
I can go back.
Thank you.
Is it in the chat?
Yes, it's from Sarah Morin asking, can you say more about the households in the central tract? Sarah, if there's something specific.
Can you say a little bit more about what you're interested in, perhaps? The sampling of the household. So we only sample from households in the yellow tract for the NSECE household surveys. They are not pulled from the gray areas. Perhaps you can say a little bit more about what you're interested in terms of sampling.
The other thing I might add, Alana, is that as you kind of alluded to, we sampled roughly the same number of households in each of those anchor tracts across the country. We would have liked to do that with providers, but there aren't always providers there to be sampled. So the number of households with the number of household interviews in a given provider cluster is often fairly stable across the country, while the number of provider interviews in that cluster can vary widely.
Awesome. Thank you, Rupa. I hope that kind of helps clarify some things, and we can, of course, talk a little bit more about that later. All right, so jumping ahead, where were we? So we're going to talk just a little bit here about the idea of cluster aggregates, because we're going to talk about that in the second activity. So importantly here, cluster aggregates, they can summarize the availability of care in a cluster using data from the providers in that cluster. So what does that take into account? The number of providers, but also different of these aggregate statistics, because they will take into account the percent of providers, for example, providing free care to all families, things like average enrollment of centers. If we don't have a lot of provider sample, we have to be considerate of our estimates. So, taking all this into account, these aggregates can be sensitive to, right, the number of observations in the cluster, and also importantly, the number of observations contributing to a specific measure. So it's always important to be conscious of the robustness of the provider level measure. Additionally, that these aggregate cluster level statistics can be merged with household survey data using cluster IDs, but NORC can do that matching for you. Additionally, we can be a little bit more confident, right, because of these kind of sensitivities of the number of observations in the cluster. We can be more confident about the estimates of certain things like the percent of centers receiving public funding, because cluster weights sum to a non-response adjusted population estimate of the number of clusters. But an estimate like the average price for infant care could be potentially less reliable because of the smaller number of centers having a given value, together with the inherent complexity, for example, of something like price measures. So now I'm going to turn this over to Rupa to give us an overview of what we're going to be doing in the first activity.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rupa Datta. I'm the principal investigator of the NSECE. We will be dividing up into small groups for the next 15 minutes or so. And we're going to do two activities, as Alana alluded to, whose primary purpose is for you all to really get kind of an intuitive feel for the heterogeneity of clusters. As you know, when you only work with data files, it's sometimes hard to visualize and get an intuitive feel for what some of the individual records might look like. So we are going to do two deepish dives to give you that sense of heterogeneity. One will be to look at some maps, and one will be to look at some sample data. So hopefully the activities gave you some sense of, as I said, the heterogeneity of the clusters, both geographically and visually, what they might look like, as well as the extent of variability you might find in data about those clusters. Things like the number of providers that are in the cluster, or something like an infant wage or 2-year-old wage, I guess. Were there any questions or observations that people wanted to share? A lot of our NSECE materials use the one map of the clusters. And so I think helping people really see the diversity of clusters can help inform analysis. Maybe some of the moderators, if there are any highlights from the conversation that you would like to share with the larger group. I'm happy to move on. I just want to make sure that people are comfortable with the file. Okay. So one of the questions in my group, I suppose we would like to see some slides. Does that look okay? One of the questions that came up in the group that I was in, which Josh was moderating, was about the sampling weights. And there are some nuances to the weights that are available and the inferences that can be made when using provider clusters as data. What we showed in the Excel file that you are looking at were what we called weighted cluster estimates. So in every provider cluster, we have a certain number of provider interviews, whether they're center-based or home-based, and that number can vary quite a bit, as you saw in the file. In places with not a lot of EC supply, often all of the providers were sampled, and close to all of them will have completed interviews and be directly represented in the data. There are, however, some very populous clusters which have a great deal of supply. And in that case, a small fraction of the providers in those clusters will have been sampled and provided data. What the cluster weight does is allow us to use the providers that are in the cluster to generate a weighted estimate. The providers that are in our data in that cluster, and we can use their information to describe all of the providers in the cluster, including the ones that were not sampled or interviewed in the NSECE. And in the file that you saw, sometimes the weighted number of centers is 2, and sometimes it's 180. So there can be quite a bit of variation. An important feature of the provider clusters is that they overlap, or they can overlap. You can see how that would happen if the two randomly sampled yellow anchor tracts are too close together, then the gray areas of the two respective provider clusters can overlap. This happens quite a bit in urban areas. As a result, we can't add up the providers across clusters because you would be double counting providers that happen to be located in multiple provider clusters. It's one building, but it happens to fall in multiple provider clusters. So when we're thinking about how we can use provider clusters and cluster aggregates in our analyses, we have to be cautious that we're not trying to use the provider clusters as observations, or that we're not trying to sum up providers across clusters. Households, because they are uniquely located in the anchor tracts, they actually can be summed up, but the clusters themselves can't be, and we want to be very cautious about how we handle providers. Again, due to this issue of overlap, we do not have a sampling weight that we can use to generate nationally representative estimates of communities. So the provider clusters may be good proxies for communities for many analyses, and we can use their data, but we need to attach that data to one of the NSECE sample populations: households, centers, listed home-based, workforce, etc. We want to attach to an existing sample that can generate nationally representative estimates and use those sampling weights for that population to describe the national situation. If we are describing the 750 provider clusters, obviously they are diverse and they span the nation, but we can't say that the percentage of clusters that have a certain feature accurately represents the percentage of communities nationally that would have that feature. This is probably the most binding restriction as people are thinking about how they might like to use provider clusters in their analyses, keeping in mind that those provider clusters themselves can't be used to generate nationally representative estimates unless they're linked to one of the main samples, and that sample's weights are used to generate the nationally representative samples. So we've talked a little bit about households and how we can use the household weight. For providers, what we have done is we've created something called the provider catchment area, which is basically applying that same definition. You take a central tract, you draw a blue circle around it, you take all of the tracts that lie all within that blue circle, and you have this larger cluster of census tracts. We call that the provider catchment area. So that would be a cluster with the provider at the center. The provider cluster has the households at the center. The provider catchment area has the provider at the center. And we can use the characteristics of a provider catchment area to attach various constructs to provider samples and then use provider weights to generate nationally representative estimates. If you are familiar with the community characteristics that we often use in NSECE analyses, like community poverty density or community urbanicity, these all use the provider cluster methodology. And when we talk about centers located in high poverty density areas, we have used those provider catchment areas for that purpose. Okay. So let's now talk about some research questions and strategies. Continuing with this idea of provider samples and provider catchment areas, what kinds of research questions could we address with providers as the unit of observation and provider catchment areas as the clusters? So consider a question like, do qualifications of centers' instructional staff vary by the race or ethnicity of the communities where they are located? So what are we doing there? We're looking at either the center data or the workforce data about staffing within centers. And then we're treating as an attribute of those cases the racial or ethnic composition of the communities where that center is located. We can then use either the center weight or the workforce weight to estimate a parameter. For example, do we see that the percentage of teachers with a VA is different in communities with high Hispanic density or compared to low or moderate Hispanic density? That's the kind of question that we can use. Here, we're really connecting the providers to the communities where they're located. The next example question we have here is, how does pricing in privately funded centers differ according to the presence of publicly funded care in their communities? So you might imagine if there's a lot of publicly funded care in a community, maybe the privately funded centers have to compete and maybe they lower their prices, or maybe they experience greater financial pressures and they have to raise their prices because all of the 4-year-olds are going to public pre-K instead. You could have either hypothesis. What we would be doing in this case is looking at privately funded centers and the prices they report, say for 3-year-old care or 4-year-old care, whichever. And then we would attach to those centers a cluster aggregate measure of, say, the percentage of centers that receive public funding. And we could then tabulate, do we see different prices in those privately funded centers in communities with high levels of publicly funded center care compared with low levels of publicly funded care? In this case, we're again, taking the center as the unit of observation, and we're connecting it to the other centers that are nearby to it within the cluster. Both of these examples are using the center-based provider as the unit of analysis. You could use the workforce in the first case. And they're either summing up nationally, or you might do it by census region, something like that. Because we are using the provider catchment area, which is centered around the provider, each provider belongs to exactly one community or cluster. That's important for the sampling issues I previously mentioned. The community characteristics data effectively have created a variety of cluster aggregates about the population. These aren't using NSECE data, they're using other data, mostly American Community Survey data, to characterize the communities where our sample exists. There are some variables in the public use data, others in what we call the level 1 restricted use data, which is available from the CFDA archive. And then there are additional community characteristics that are available in the level 2 and the most restricted environment. The 2012 Household Users Guide has an extensive list of all of the different community characteristics that are available, and you can always request others. So let's talk about the household side. We can also generate household research questions that use the household as the unit of analysis. And in particular, what's really exciting about the provider cluster and why we designed it in the first place is that you can connect the households to the ECE supply locally, to the providers that are geographically near that household. That's the whole point of the provider cluster. In that case, we would be constructing the kinds of cluster aggregates we saw in the activity. We would attach those as characteristics of the household, and then we would conduct either a household analysis, maybe a child level analysis to ask questions of the data. There are many ways to approach analyses that connect households with providers. We often say on the NSECE, there is almost certainly no right way to do this. There may be a variety of reasonable options. What you want to do is think through what the advantages and disadvantages are of those different options and choose the analytic approach that best meets your needs. And that could be from a disclosure perspective, an interpretation perspective, how much effort it would take perspective. There are lots of different considerations. Some of the things to think about as you're thinking about how you want to connect your household data to the provider data. In theory, you could connect every household to every potential provider. That would be an extremely computationally intense activity. Mostly nobody does that. Instead, what we commonly do would be to aggregate and create some summary measures, either on the household side or on the provider side, or both, and then conduct analyses using those summary measures. When you take that approach, some of the things to keep in mind are, we're going to ask these 4 questions. So one is, how well do my measures represent the population? In this case, we can think about, well, the household, we have a relatively stable number of households that are representing hundreds of other households in a community. If we have, 10 or 13 households in a provider cluster, and we're measuring a relatively rare characteristic like, do they have an infant and does the parent work nights and weekends? If you aggregate across a lot of clusters, you'll get a good estimate of households with infants who work where the parents work night hours. But it's unlikely that those households accurately represent the diversity of other households in their community when we have very small numbers. So we always want to be thinking about if I'm choosing this as my representative of the cluster or the county or the state, how well does the measure I've chosen actually represent what's happening at that geography? The second question we think about is, how much sample size am I actually able to bring to this estimate? In some cases, we might have thousands of observations that we're using in a computation, and in some cases, we might have a handful, and that will affect the robustness of the estimate. Of course, we're concerned with whether the estimate would be conceptually meaningful or not. And then finally, how can I convey the estimate? We find often that using the provider clusters, the sentences are long because we're saying things like publicly funded centers located in communities with high proportions of privately funded care or something like that. And that can matter when clarity of interpretation is important, which it usually is. So we are going to now move into our next activity, which I will set up for you, which is really to practice these questions about how well is my measure capturing something, how well, what kind of sample size do I have available, and thinking about the different options for aggregating the household data and the provider data for an estimate. So for this work, we're going to choose an example research question. The question we've chosen is, what is the availability of non-standard hours care for parents who work non-standard hours? So what we're trying to do is we're thinking about the household survey data has information about parents who work non-standard hours. The provider surveys have data about whether or not providers offer care during non-standard hours. In the NSECE, we use a fairly common definition that sort of, I think 8 to 6, Monday through Friday is standard, and the entire rest of the week is non-standard. So what are our options for linking these household data about parents' work schedules with provider data about availability of care? So here are some different options that we've considered, that we've seen other researchers use, that all have the basic intent of linking household data to provider data. And they really all vary. The dimension, there are two dimensions that I think of. One is, which measures am I aggregating? Am I aggregating on the provider side? Am I aggregating on the household side, or both? So that's one question. And then the other question is, what is the unit of geography I'm using for the aggregation? And so here we have 4 different options. Option 1 would be that you aggregate both the households and the providers to the PSU level. Again, the PSUs are mostly counties, sometimes county clusters. So in this case, we have 220 primary sampling units, and for each of them, we would have a summary measure of % of households that work non-standard hours, or average night hours worked by parents or something like that, and then a summary provider measure. you know, percent of providers in the PSU that are open weekends or something like that. And so you have these two county level measures, one on the household side, one on the provider side, and you treat your data set as 220 observations. You could correlate them, you could cross-tab them, whatever. The second option is to collapse on the household side, so create aggregate measures on the household side at the cluster level, but then keep the providers unaggregated. So use the provider data still at the individual provider level, but divide up the clusters maybe into clusters with high proportions of parents using non-standard hour, working non-standard hours, low proportions of parents using non-standard hours. So we would have basically grouped the country into groups of clusters which vary in their average need for non-standard hours care. And then we could describe the providers located in those places. So in that case, we're using clusters as the geography. We're creating summary parent measures, but keeping the providers as individual observations. Option 3 is kind of the reverse. We keep the households as individual records, but we create cluster level aggregates of provider availability. So we would say things like, what percentage of, among households who have high non-standard hour work, what fraction of them are in clusters that have any non-standard hours care or a lot of non-standard hours care, that kind of thing. And then option 4 is kind of like option 1 in that we're collapsing both the household and the provider side, but we're doing it at the cluster level rather than the PSU level. So these are 4 different options. I'm going to let the moderators answer questions about them. What we're going to ask you to do is think through 2 of the 4 of these options and go through these different questions that we've suggested are important to you. How well does that household aggregate or that provider aggregate represent the population? How many observations would I actually have in my analysis? Would the estimate be conceptually meaningful? This could include statistical inferences. And then how would I actually say in words what the relationship is that I've measured? So we're going to spend about 15 minutes trying to think through the advantages and disadvantages of these collapsing options in bringing together household data with provider data. Let's see first maybe whether any favorites emerged or where there were any main comments about the different options. Maybe I'll share just the list of options to remind us whether there were groups came away with any sort of really important observations about these different options that anyone wanted to share. Maybe the moderators, if participants want to share, that's great. Otherwise, moderators maybe represent the conversation that occurred in your rooms. Betsy, you said option 3. May I ask you to say a few things about that?
Sure. So I just shared in our breakout room that option 3 made the most sense to me when we talked through option 2 and option 3, because of the work that we're doing. We're starting with the family. Like that's we're interested in families' experiences in terms of accessing childcare that meets their individualized family needs. So it makes the most sense to me to start at the household level, and then compare that to the amount of providers in the area that have the capacity to provide non-standard hours of care.
Were there discussions? I know not every group would have compared the same options. Were there other groups that favored or were shunned one of the other options?
Yeah, I think in our group, it was mostly, we similarly talked about option 3 as well for the most part, but then at the end kind of tried to do a compare and contrast of the option 1 and option 4. So I guess option 2 got left out. I think that part of it was also understanding that once you get the data in those forms, the 220 and the 750 observations, what can you say about them, and do they actually answer your question that you're looking at, and whether knowing what data you're using, does that shape the question you're answering or how you answer it, I guess.
Okay, we are just about to run out of time, so I think we do want to think about the numbers of observations. Some of these options you actually can't get nationally representative estimates out of. And so that may be a decisive feature. And also when we think about the provider catchment areas, we have much more limited data about the provider catchment areas than we do about the provider clusters. So those were some of the big differentiators. Any of the work that you are likely to do with provider clusters will require level 2 restricted use access, which NRC administers. We did talk about the fact that the community characteristics variables that are available variously in all NSECE data files might allow you to do some work with outside of the level 2 environment. But many of the options we've discussed do require level 2 access. At this point, we've had hundreds of people use level 2 access. And so we've learned a lot, hopefully, about how to effectively support researchers, and we learn a lot from the creativity of researchers. Cluster IDs aren't released directly to researchers to protect against disclosure, but we provide a simulated cluster ID that's almost as good. What you do is you write your code on that simulated cluster. You can explore, you can estimate, and then when you have things that you're happy with, then you give us your code, we just run it on the actual cluster IDs and give you the final results, which are very similar usually to what you had originally derived from the simulated data. Researchers may have direct access either to cluster aggregates or to state identifiers, but not both. When we get too much information about the clusters and know what state they're in, it's actually quite easy to identify the actual location of the clusters, which is not in keeping with our privacy guarantees to respondents. And then we have some limits on cluster aggregates for clusters with very low counts of providers. If there's one provider, then we will not provide you the mean price because you would know then who that was. But those are probably not as useful observations anyway. So just thank you so much for joining us. We want to note that the provider cluster is a really useful way to define community, but provider clusters are very heterogeneous. Research questions can be a bit limited by the sampling weights and the availability of data for provider catchment areas, and can be sensitive to how many providers there are in an area. The level 2 processes are generally flexible enough that whatever you want to do is possible, but we may need to work with you so that your idea can get expressed within the disclosure possibilities of the data set. So we are at 90 minutes. We really are grateful for you to have joined us. We want to remind you of this nsec@norc.org email address where you can email with any questions you have about the NSEC data. We are always happy to talk to researchers about their potential ideas and, of course, to help with level 2 access. Thank you so much for joining us today.